He looked at me like I was the problem. It was just one sentence, 5 words, but they sank deeper than any scream ever could. "You're too much," he said. And the way he said it, calm, cold, as if he wasn't dropping a bomb, just delivering a fact. I remember freezing. My throat closed like my voice had suddenly become too heavy to carry. I stared at him, trying to figure out if he meant it as a joke, or if I was just being sensitive again. But no, he meant it. And he said it like he had been holding it in for a long time. Too emotional, too intense, too sensitive, too deep, too loud, too alive. I had spent so much of that relationship trying to be less reactive, less expressive, less needy, and still too much. So in that moment, I chose silence. Not because I agreed, not because I believed him, but because I was tired. Tired of defending my softness, tired of explaining my feelings, tired of shrinking in hopes of fitting into someone else's version of just enough. And that silence, it changed everything. Before a story becomes transformation, it begins in rupture. That sentence, "You're too much," was my rupture. But also, unknowingly, my doorway. Carl Jung once wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But no one tells you that becoming who you are often starts with someone telling you not to be." And that's where I was, frozen, silenced, unsure whether to speak again or disappear entirely. Before I take you into the story of how I chose myself, I want to ask something from you. Tell me in the comments, have you ever been told you were too much? Too intense, too sensitive, too honest, too alive? Tell me where you're watching from. You're not alone, and you never were. Because here's what I've learned. They don't call you too much when they're capable of meeting you where you are. They say it when your truth threatens their comfort. They say it when your emotional honesty shines too bright for someone who still lives in shadows. They say it when they can't handle the fact that you refuse to pretend. But that doesn't make you too much. It makes them too afraid. Still, I believed it. I didn't want to, but I did. Because when someone says you're too much over and over, especially when you love them, you start trying to solve it. And how do we solve being too much? We tone it down. We apologize when we cry. We rewrite texts 5 times so we don't sound too emotional. We wait hours before replying so we don't look desperate. We laugh softer, feel quieter, need less. And we slowly, so slowly, start to disappear. Until one day we're still there. But not really. That's what I became. Someone who stayed physically present, but emotionally hidden. I chose silence as a shield. I thought I was protecting the relationship. But in truth, I was burying myself. Because here's the most dangerous part about being called too much. You start confusing your natural expression with dysfunction. You begin to believe that your way of loving, fiercely, fully, loudly, is wrong. You stop trusting your gut. You second-guess every instinct. You edit your personality in real time. You become a mirror of what's acceptable instead of a reflection of who you are. And in that process, you lose your voice. But let's be honest. If you've ever been told you're too much, there's a very good chance you are something rare. Because too much is often code for, you make me feel things I don't want to feel. And people who aren't ready to feel will always try to make you smaller. That's the part I wish someone had told me back then, but at the time all I knew was that my emotions made him uncomfortable, my tears made him impatient, my enthusiasm made him withdraw. So I did what so many of us do when faced with that rejection. I internalized it. I made it about me. I thought, if I can just be less intense, less reactive, more chill, maybe he'll stay. But let me tell you something with all the love and all the truth I have. Anyone who only stays when you are less than yourself is not staying for you. They're staying for a version of you that betrays your soul. And the longer you maintain that version, the more your soul begins to suffocate. That's where I was, quiet, careful, contorted. But deep down I knew something was breaking. And that break, that fracture between who I was and who I was pretending to be, became impossible to ignore. So I did the only thing I could. I chose silence, not as surrender, but as space. I needed to stop performing long enough to remember what my real voice even sounded like. And it was in that silence that I started to hear her again, the me I had silenced to be loved. She didn't say much at first, just a whisper. But the whisper said, "This isn't who you are." There's a strange thing that happens when you hear the same words over and over again. They don't just echo in your mind, they start living in your body. You're too much. I carried those words like a weight. I felt them in my shoulders, slumped forward so I wouldn't take up too much space. I felt them in my voice, softer, smaller, careful not to rise too loud. I felt them in my laughter, muted, restrained, clipped before it could spill out freely. I felt them everywhere, and I thought that maybe if I learned to be less, I would finally be loved more. But here's the truth Jung would remind us of. The parts of us we reject, deny, or hide never disappear. They sink into what he called the shadow, and the shadow always finds its way back. So while I was busy being less, my shadow was growing. It showed up in resentment, in secret tears, in the way my body tightened every time I swallowed my feelings, in the exhaustion of playing a role that wasn't mine. I thought I was protecting love by shrinking, but what I was really doing was betraying myself. And betrayal, when it's self-betrayal, always leaves scars. Let me ask you something. Have you ever looked in the mirror and felt like a stranger? Not because your face changed, but because your eyes didn't hold the same fire anymore. That's what self-betrayal looks like. That's what silencing yourself to be loved creates, and that's why the phrase "too much" is so dangerous. It's not just an opinion, it's a blade, and when you let it cut you long enough, you start carving away pieces of yourself until you're unrecognizable. But here's the thing, maybe you've already felt this. Being too much was never the problem. Being too much was just being you. Too passionate, too emotional, too present, too alive, too real. And when the wrong person meets that kind of energy, they call it too much. But when the right people meet it, they call it exactly enough. I wish I had known that then. Instead, I kept choosing silence. I thought silence would protect me. If I didn't speak, I couldn't be too much. If I didn't cry, I couldn't be called dramatic. If I didn't laugh too loud, I couldn't embarrass him. But here's what silence taught me. Silence doesn't erase your truth. It just buries it deeper. And when something true is buried, it doesn't die. It grows roots, it waits, it pushes, it rises, and one day it breaks through. That's what happened to me. My silence turned into a mirror that showed me just how much of myself I had abandoned. I realized I hadn't been too much. I had been too honest for his comfort, and that realization changed everything. Because suddenly, it wasn't about me anymore. It wasn't about fixing myself, editing myself, shrinking myself. It was about recognizing that maybe, just maybe, the problem wasn't my intensity. The problem was his inability to hold it. Carl Jung said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." And maybe that's what scared him about me. Maybe my willingness to feel, to express, to exist fully was a mirror he didn't want to face. Maybe my intensity lit up the parts of himself he had buried, and instead of meeting me there, he pushed me away. And so I kept choosing silence, until one day I realized that silence wasn't peace. It was punishment, not his punishment, mine. I wasn't silencing myself to protect love. I was silencing myself because I had started to believe the lie, that I was too much, and that lie had stolen pieces of me I would never get back. But here's the thing about lies. Once you see them, you can't unsee them. So I started to ask myself, what if I'm not too much? What if I'm just enough? What if the very things he couldn't handle about me, the depth, the tears, the intensity, the fire, were the very things that made me extraordinary? What if the problem was never that I felt too deeply, but that he couldn't feel enough? That thought became my turning point, because silence had taught me something. It taught me that muting my soul wasn't the solution. It taught me that playing small wasn't love. It was fear. It taught me that choosing silence as a shield only made me lonelier. And it taught me that if I didn't stop now, I would keep betraying myself forever. So the silence that once held me prisoner became the silence that set me free. In that silence, I stopped listening to him, and I started listening to me. Silence became my teacher. At first, I thought silence meant defeat, that keeping my thoughts inside was proof that I wasn't strong enough to defend myself. But the longer I sat with it, the more I realized something. Silence isn't always weakness. Sometimes silence is space. Space to breathe, space to see, space to listen to myself. When I stopped defending who I was, I discovered I didn't need to prove my worth anymore. I didn't need to explain why I cared so deeply, why I felt so much, why my love was overwhelming. I only needed to understand it, to honor it, to accept it. And in the quiet, I finally heard myself again. Carl Jung said, "Who looks outside, dreams. Who looks inside, awakes." And that was me. Awakening. Not all at once, but slowly, quietly, through stillness. The voice I had silenced for so long began whispering again. It said, "You are not too much. You are whole. You are not dramatic. You are alive. You are not a burden. You are a blessing." Those whispers became louder the more I trusted them, and soon I realized something powerful. When I stopped trying to be enough for someone else, I finally felt enough for myself. Let me tell you what that shift felt like. It wasn't fireworks. It wasn't some magical transformation overnight. It was small moments. Sitting at a cafe with my journal, not rushing to check my phone. Walking through a bookstore and letting myself feel excited about stories again. Laughing loudly with a friend without apologizing. Crying at a song without calling myself weak. It was ordinary life, but lived in honesty. And that was extraordinary. Here's something I want you to hear. Choosing yourself doesn't mean you stop loving others. It doesn't mean you build walls so high no one can reach you. It means you stop abandoning yourself for the sake of being loved. And that's what I had been doing, abandoning myself. But the silence taught me, if I abandon me, it doesn't matter who stays, because I'll always be empty. So I began showing up for myself, every day in small ways, making meals just for me, taking walks just for me, speaking kindly to myself, even when I wanted to tear myself down. Because if I didn't start treating myself like I mattered, no one else would. And slowly I began to realize something huge. I wasn't too much. I was just too rare for someone who didn't know what to do with rarity. Think about that. Diamonds don't apologize for shining too brightly. Oceans don't apologize for being too vast. Fire doesn't apologize for being too hot. So why was I apologizing for being me? The truth is, the world needs people who feel deeply, who laugh loudly, who cry openly, who love intensely. The world needs people who are unafraid of their own depth, and maybe the reason someone told you that you were too much is because they were terrified of their own emptiness. That's what I finally saw. It wasn't me, it was him. He couldn't handle the weight of real intimacy. He couldn't meet the depth of real connection. He couldn't stand in the presence of real emotion. So instead of admitting that, he turned it into my flaw. And I believed him, until the silence showed me the truth. Silence gave me back my power. It showed me that when I stopped explaining, stopped defending, stopped proving, I could finally rest. I could finally breathe. I could finally see that my worth was never up for debate. I was never too much. I was always enough. And the moment I stopped arguing with him in my head, I started speaking with myself in my heart. That was the shift. The day I stopped asking, why can't he accept me? And started asking, why can't I accept myself? That question changed everything. Because when you begin to accept yourself completely, the world around you changes too. The people who once made you feel like a burden drift away, and the people who see you, really see you, begin to appear, not because you were never worthy, but because now you finally act like it. And that's what silence taught me. I didn't lose my voice. I reclaimed it. Not to shout louder, not to prove more, not to convince anyone, but to whisper to myself, I choose you always. When I stopped proving, I started listening. And in that listening, I realized something I had never dared to admit. The version of me he wanted wasn't real. She was smaller, quieter, lighter, more agreeable. And I had been wearing that mask for so long, I almost forgot what my own face looked like. Carl Jung called this the persona, the mask we wear to survive. And mine was built out of silence, out of restraint, out of fear of being rejected for my fullness. But here's the truth. The mask might keep you loved by others, but it will always keep you lonely with yourself. And I was tired of being lonely. So I asked myself, what would my life look like if I stopped editing who I was, not just in relationships, but everywhere? What would it feel like to laugh without covering my mouth, to speak without rehearsing, to cry without apologizing, to want what I want without guilt? At first, those questions terrified me, because the mask had become safe, predictable, familiar. But safety isn't the same as truth, and I knew it. So I started small. I gave myself permission to take up space again, to sit in a room without folding my arms and legs like I was trying to disappear, to wear the clothes that made me feel alive, not the ones that made me blend in, to say no without writing a 3-paragraph explanation. And with each act of honesty, I felt myself returning, the fire in my eyes, the spark in my voice, the fullness in my heart. I wasn't too much. I was me. And that was more than enough. But here's something important. Choosing yourself doesn't mean rejecting everyone else. It means learning to stand so firmly in who you are that you don't need someone else's approval to exist. It means you can love others from a place of wholeness, not desperation. And that's when everything shifts. Because once you choose yourself, your standards change. The people who once made you doubt your worth no longer have power over you. Their voices grow faint. Their absence doesn't destroy you. Their rejection doesn't define you. Why? Because you're not waiting for them to choose you anymore. You've already chosen yourself. Let me tell you what that freedom feels like. It feels like walking into a room without wondering if you're too loud. It feels like laughing until your stomach hurts without checking if anyone's annoyed. It feels like saying, "This is who I am," without bracing for rejection. It feels like peace. Not the fragile peace that comes from keeping everyone else comfortable, but the deep, unshakable peace that comes from knowing you're finally comfortable with yourself. Jung called this individuation, the process of becoming whole, of integrating the parts of yourself you once rejected. And that's what I was doing. Piece by piece, I was bringing myself back. The part of me that was emotional, the part of me that was passionate, the part of me that was fiery, the part of me that was vulnerable. All of it. And I realized something. I was never too much. I was just too rare to be understood by someone who hadn't yet learned to understand themselves. That was his truth, not mine. And once I understood that, I no longer needed revenge. I no longer needed him to admit he was wrong. I no longer needed an apology, because the most powerful apology I could ever receive was the one I gave myself when I said, "I'm sorry for silencing you. I will never abandon you again." That moment was everything, because choosing yourself isn't selfish. It's survival, it's healing, it's freedom. And when you finally do it, you stop being afraid of losing people, because you know the one person you'll never lose again is you. So here we are. The girl who once believed she had to be less, now standing whole, unedited, unapologetic. The words "you're too much" used to feel like chains, heavy, binding, a sentence I thought I had to serve forever. But now, they feel like proof. Proof that I was always more alive than he knew how to hold. Proof that I never needed to shrink, I needed to expand. And I did. Because the truth is, every time someone calls you too much, what they're really saying is, "You feel too deeply for me. You love too openly for me. You exist too fully for me." That is not your burden, that is their limitation. Carl Jung said, "I am not what happened to me, I am what I choose to become." And I chose to become someone who no longer apologizes for her fullness, someone who no longer silences herself to be loved, someone who knows that intensity is not a curse, it's a gift, because the world doesn't need smaller people, it doesn't need quieter hearts, it doesn't need dimmed souls. The world needs people who are willing to be everything they are, and that's you. So if you've been told you're too sensitive, too emotional, too complicated, too passionate, too anything, hear me. You are not too much. You are exactly enough, and you don't have to disappear to be worthy of love. You don't need to wait for someone else to validate your fire. You only need to stop hiding it from yourself. The day I chose silence, it wasn't the end of me. It was the beginning. Because in that silence, I stopped listening to voices that told me to shrink, and I started listening to the one voice that mattered, my own. And that voice led me home, to my laughter, to my tears, to my fire, to my softness, to all of me. So no, I wasn't too much. I was too real for someone not ready. I was too alive for someone half asleep. I was too honest for someone hiding from themselves. And that was never my flaw. It was my freedom. So I'll leave you with this. If someone ever tells you you're too much, smile gently and say, "Then I'm not for you, because I'll never be less again." That is power. That is healing. That is what it means to choose yourself. If this story spoke to you, tell me in the comments, what words did someone use to make you feel small? And what truth do you choose to tell yourself now? Subscribe if you're ready to keep walking this path of honesty, of wholeness, of self-love. Share this with someone who has ever been told they were too much. Let them know they are exactly enough. And I'll leave you with one last whisper from Jung. The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. You don't have to be less. You don't have to disappear. You don't have to apologize. You only have to accept yourself. Fully. Fiercely. Finally.